Thomas Reed saw the buzzards before he saw the woman, black shapes circling low against the pale sky where nothing worth circling should have been, and the sight pulled him off his horse with a speed he didn't bother to hide, because some signs did not wait for caution. He followed the line of disturbed grass into a shallow draw where the wind cut hard and honest, and there she was, half sheltered by a rock that offered shade without mercy, her dress torn, her boots mismatched, one hand pressed to her side as if holding herself together by will alone. She did not cry out when he approached. She lifted her eyes instead, steady and dry, the look of someone who had already learned what asking did to people who wanted reasons to leave. Thomas knelt at a distance first, reading the ground the way he always did, the drag marks that said she'd been moved and left where returning would cost effort, the wagon tracks that turned away clean instead of circling back, the deliberate neatness of abandonment. And the truth settled heavy because this wasn't an accident or a quarrel gone wrong. It was a decision carried out in daylight. He asked her name, and she gave it without hesitation. Mary Collins, then said nothing more, not about who had brought her here or why, as if names had already failed her once, and she would not spend them again. The wind worried at her hair, and Thomas slipped his coat around her shoulders, noticing how she flinched not from pain but from surprise, and that reaction tightened something in his chest, because surprise meant she had expected nothing at all. He checked the wound quickly and quietly, the cut bad but survivable if time cooperated, and time was the one thing people stole when they left you like this. Thomas stood then and looked back toward the open land, measuring distance to his ranch, the angle of the sun, the cost of being seen carrying someone his neighbors had already decided not to, and he felt the familiar pull to keep moving, to mind his fences and his stock, and the silence that kept his life simple. Mary watched him without hope or accusation, and that was what decided it, because resignation like that did not belong to the land. It belonged to people. He crouched again and told her he would get her out of the wind, not promising more than that, because promises, once spoken, asked to be kept in full. As he lifted her, light as hunger, he felt the weight of eyes that were not there yet but would be, the kind that followed consequences back to their source, and he understood that whatever her family had decided, it had not ended here. He set her on his horse and turned toward home, the buzzards drifting away as if disappointed, and Mary closed her eyes against his shoulder, breathing shallow but steady, while Thomas made a promise without words, the kind that rearranged a man's days whether he expected it to or not, because once you chose not to walk away, the land remembered, and it asked you to finish what you started. Thomas took the long way back to the ranch, angling across open ground just enough to be seen, and then slipping into the folds of land where tracks broke apart, because carrying a wounded woman invited questions he wasn't ready to answer, and patience bought better margins than speed. Mary did not speak as they rode. She held the saddle horn with careful strength, breath measured, pain kept on a short leash, and the restraint told him she understood what attention cost in places like this. When the ranch came into view, low and plain against the prairie, Thomas felt the familiar relief of a place that asked little and kept what it was given, and he led the horse behind the barn first, away from the road, tying off where shadows did their quiet work. Inside the house, he set her down on the narrow bed and moved without ceremony, heating water, cutting cloth, laying out what he had with the calm of a man who fixed what was in front of him before naming the rest. The wound was ugly but clean, the kind that healed if tended and punished neglect without warning, and Thomas cleaned it thoroughly, binding it tight enough to stop the bleed without stealing feeling, noting how Mary watched his hands rather than his face, learning what kind of man he was by what he did not rush. She asked once where they were, and he answered simply, "My place," leaving the door open to whatever that might mean, and the simplicity seemed to steady her because it offered shelter without ownership. Outside, the wind shifted and Thomas paused, listening past the creak of boards and the low talk of cattle for sounds that didn't belong, finding none and trusting that less than certainty because certainty made men careless. He gave her water and waited while she drank, counting swallows, then set a lamp low and told her to sleep. Not as an order, but as an option. And when she closed her eyes, he felt the promise he'd made press closer, asking for shape. He stepped onto the porch and looked out over the land he knew by habit, measuring how far consequences traveled from a decision made in daylight. And he understood that families who left someone to die rarely stayed quiet when that someone did not. When he returned inside, Mary was awake, eyes following him, and he told her he would not send her back to the place she'd been left. Not today, and not tomorrow. And the promise landed heavier than anything he'd said because it named a direction without pretending to know the road. She did not thank him. She nodded once, the acceptance of someone who knew better than to spend relief too early. And Thomas felt the line he'd crossed settle into the house like a second hearth. As the night deepened and the ranch held steady around them, Thomas understood the promise he hadn't explained yet would ask to be tested soon, not by Mary, but by the people who had walked away and expected the land to finish their work. And when that moment came, he intended to be ready to answer without raising his voice or lowering his eyes. He woke before dawn to the sound of the wind worrying the eaves, a steady insistence that carried news if you knew how to listen. And he lay still long enough to decide whether the night had changed anything it needed to. It hadn't. Mary slept shallow and quiet on the bed, breath even but guarded, the kind of sleep that kept one ear open for footsteps, and the sight confirmed what he already knew, that whatever her family had left behind would not be finished simply because he had brought her inside. He checked the wound again, satisfied with the binding, and set coffee to heat, letting the ordinary sounds of morning settle the house into something less like a hiding place and more like a home that expected work to be done. When Mary woke, she asked how far the nearest road was, and Thomas answered in time rather than distance, telling her it was far enough that people didn't come by accident, and the relief that crossed her face told him accidents had never been part of her story. He asked then, carefully, why her family had chosen the draw instead of the house, the wagon instead of help, and she stared at the wall a moment before saying they were afraid, not of her dying, but of what keeping her would cost them, and the clarity of it cut because fear that practical usually dressed itself as necessity. Thomas nodded, accepting the truth without trying to soften it, and said fear made people decisive in the wrong direction when they believed time would do the rest. And Mary closed her eyes, as if the sentence finished something she'd been carrying alone. Outside, a rider passed on the far fence line, slow enough to look, and Thomas felt the pressure sharpen because distance didn't erase attention, it only delayed it, and families who abandoned did not always leave the matter to chance. He told Mary they would move her to the back room before noon, not to hide, but to control what could be seen from the road, and she agreed without asking why, already understanding that survival was a series of adjustments made before explanations arrived. As the sun climbed and the land woke fully, Thomas worked the chores that couldn't wait, aware that each familiar task anchored him to a decision that was no longer theoretical. And when he glanced back at the house, he felt the promise settled deeper, not as a burden, but as a measure of who he would be when the reason her family hadn't returned finally showed itself and asked to be answered. By mid-morning, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the faintest trace of sound from the road that cut the prairie into long, patient lines, and Thomas felt the change before he saw it, because the land warned you when it was about to be used as leverage. He finished the last of the chores and moved Mary to the back room, without ceremony, not hiding her so much as narrowing the angles from which she could be observed. and she accepted the change with the same quiet calculation she brought to pain, asking only where she should sit so the light wouldn't pull at the wound. Thomas showed her, and then stepped outside, scanning the distance where heat shimmered and shapes lied easily, trusting his eyes only after they failed him once, twice, enough times to teach humility. The rider he'd noticed earlier had stopped farther down the fence line, horse angled wrong for grazing, posture too still, and Thomas understood that counting had begun, the kind that weighed risk against inconvenience before deciding how much cruelty could be afforded. He walked the fence with deliberate slowness, mending nothing, checking nothing, giving the watcher exactly the story he wanted to be seen telling. That this place ran on routine and would not be rushed into confession. Inside, Mary listened to the house settle and thought of her family's faces as they had been that morning, careful and resolved, the way people looked when they believed necessity absolved them. And she felt the old ache rise not from the wound, but from the knowledge that being loved had never been the same as being kept. When Thomas returned, he brought bread and water, and sat across from her without asking for more than she was ready to give. And she told him then that the promise he had made would be tested not by her weakness but by her usefulness, because her family had not left her to die out of malice but calculation, believing her absence would quiet a debt they could not pay. The words tightened the room, because debts had a way of traveling farther than people. And Thomas felt the shape of the coming trouble sharpen, understanding that someone would arrive with a story that made abandonment sound reasonable and rescue look reckless. He asked who would come, and Mary said no one important at first, just enough authority to feel official, just enough kinship to make refusal uncomfortable, and the accuracy of it settled his jaw because it named a pressure he recognized. Outside, the rider turned back toward the road at last, decision made, and Thomas knew the cost had been counted and found acceptable, not yet paid, but priced. He stood and told Mary they would not argue when the time came. They would listen, and then he would answer once, clearly, and let the land do the rest. She watched him with something like relief edged with fear, understanding that promises kept clean often angered those who relied on confusion, and as the day leaned toward afternoon and the prairie held its breath, Thomas felt the next test approach, not with speed, but with certainty, the kind that asked whether the promise he had made without words could stand when spoken out loud and heard by people who expected the land to finish what they had started. The wagon arrived without hurry, rolling up the long approach as if it had always intended to stop, and Thomas watched it from the porch with his weight settled and his hands empty, because men who came confident enough to move slowly believed the answer already leaned their way. Mary heard it too, and straightened in the back room, pain forgotten long enough to make space for resolve. And Thomas met her eyes once before stepping down, not to reassure, but to confirm that whatever followed would be faced in daylight. 2 men climbed down when the wagon halted, boots clean, coats buttoned, the look of people who had prepared a reason and expected it to be sufficient. And Thomas waited for them to speak first, because silence forced explanations to show their seams. They did not ask how Mary was. They asked whether she was there, the phrasing careful and detached. And Thomas answered that she was under his roof and being treated, the words plain enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. One of the men smiled thinly and spoke of family duty and hard times, of choices made to protect the many over the one. And Thomas listened without interrupting, letting the story complete itself because incomplete stories asked to be corrected. When the man finished, Thomas said only that leaving someone to die was not protection. It was abandonment dressed in arithmetic, and the statement landed heavier than accusation because it named the thing without heat. Mary stepped into the doorway then, leaning on the frame for balance, her face pale but steady, and the men flinched despite themselves, surprise breaking their composure because they had expected the land to do their work quietly. She spoke once, naming what had been taken and what had been owed, not pleading and not accusing, and the simplicity of it stripped their story bare, leaving calculation exposed. Thomas watched the men recalculate, anger flickering as the cost rose in public, and he felt the promise settle fully into words as he said he would not send her back, not today and not ever, and that any claim they believed they had would be answered openly, or not at all. The men argued then, invoking necessity and consequence, but the porch and the open yard held their voices up where neighbors could hear, and Thomas felt the land shift because daylight changed the terms. When the wagon finally turned away, slower than it had come, Thomas knew the promise had been tested and found expensive, and as he closed the door behind Mary and set his hand briefly at her back, he understood that keeping it would not end the trouble, but it had already ended the question of who he was willing to be when arithmetic tried to pass itself off as mercy. The dust from the wagon lingered longer than Thomas expected, hanging low over the yard as if the land itself was reluctant to forget what had been said there, and he stood on the porch until it settled because moments like that deserved to be closed deliberately. Inside, Mary lowered herself into the chair by the window, breath shallow but steady, and the quiet between them felt earned rather than fragile, the kind that followed a truth spoken aloud and not taken back. Thomas checked the bandage again, more from habit than worry, and felt the heat had eased just enough to promise recovery if patience held. And patience was something he had already decided to spend. Mary asked if the men would return, and Thomas answered honestly, saying they would talk first and think later, because people who lost control in daylight preferred distance while they recalculated, and the answer seemed to steady her because it did not pretend safety was permanent. As afternoon wore on, the ranch resumed its ordinary work, cattle moving, wind shifting, the world insisting on continuity, and Thomas felt the promise root itself deeper. No longer a reaction, but a direction that shaped his choices without asking to be named again. Mary slept for a while then, deeper than before, and Thomas used the time to repair what had been left unfinished, not because fences needed it, but because movement anchored resolve better than reflection. When she woke, she spoke of her family again, not with bitterness, but clarity, saying they would tell themselves a story where leaving her had been unavoidable. And Thomas listened because understanding the lie mattered more than condemning it. He told her that stories like that worked only until someone refused to repeat them, and she nodded, understanding that refusal had already begun. As the sun dipped and shadows lengthened across the prairie, Thomas felt no urgency to move her or himself, because staying had become an act rather than an omission, and the ranch, plain and unremarkable as it was, held them without protest. He cooked simply and ate beside her without ceremony, and the normalcy mattered because it turned rescue into routine, the only form of protection that lasted. Outside, the road lay empty and unconcerned, and Thomas understood that what stayed after they left was not fear or defiance, but a promise made ordinary by being kept, one day at a time, until it no longer needed to be tested to prove it was real. The night came on slow and windless, the kind that let sounds travel without warning, and Thomas felt the old vigilance return, not as fear, but as habit, because promises, once spoken, were often tested again when witnesses were gone. He banked the lamp low and sat at the table with his back to the wall, listening past the creak of boards and the soft rustle of grass for anything that did not belong. And Mary watched him from the bed without asking, understanding that quiet was sometimes the loudest preparation. Near midnight, a horse passed on the far road, hooves measured, pace deliberate, and Thomas did not rise, choosing stillness because men who wanted to be noticed slowed, while men who wanted answers came straight on. The sound faded and returned once, closer this time, then drifted away for good. And Thomas felt the message settle because it wasn't a threat, but a reminder, the kind meant to reopen questions that had already been answered. He checked the door bar and the window latches without ceremony, and returned to his seat, letting the night see him unchanged. And Mary breathed easier when she realized he would not be drawn into another argument simply because darkness offered cover. When sleep finally took her again, Thomas stayed awake a while longer, thinking of how easily promises were undone when they relied on confrontation alone, and how much stronger they became when they were folded into routine instead. By the time dawn thinned the dark, the ranch stood untouched, the road empty, and Thomas understood the night had tried and failed to find a weakness, because the promise he had made did not depend on being defended repeatedly, only on being lived. And as he rose to start the day, he felt the quiet confidence of a man who knew that what mattered most had already been decided and would not be negotiated again. Morning arrived clear and cold, the kind that sharpened outlines and made choices feel honest, and Thomas felt the shift as he stepped outside, the ranch settling into its familiar rhythm without asking him to justify what it now sheltered. Mary woke stronger than she had the day before, pain still present but no longer ruling every breath, and Thomas took that as permission to plan rather than merely endure. He brought her food and spoke of the land beyond his fences, of work that needed hands and places where people judged less quickly when effort arrived before explanation. And Mary listened with attention that told him she understood the difference between being hidden and being placed. As he helped her stand and test the splint, Thomas felt the promise stretch into something practical, not an abstract vow, but a sequence of steps that could be taken without spectacle. Outside, neighbors passed on the distant road, wagons moving with ordinary purpose, and no one slowed, which mattered because it meant the story had lost its urgency in the way that allowed lives to continue. Mary asked if she should leave once she could ride, and Thomas answered that she would leave when she was ready, and not before, the boundary clear enough to protect them both. And the relief that crossed her face told him she had expected conditions and found none. They spent the day making the house accommodate another presence without changing its nature, moving a chair, clearing a shelf, small adjustments that turned shelter into residence without claiming ownership. And Thomas understood this was how promises endured, by being absorbed into daily decisions until they no longer felt like promises at all. When evening came, Mary sat on the porch and watched the sun drop into the grasslands, and Thomas felt the quiet certainty settle that the way forward did not require confrontation or escape, only patience and consistency. The land did not resist the change, it accepted it, and as the light faded and the first stars appeared, Thomas knew the promise no one had expected had become the simplest thing of all, a path laid one ordinary step at a time, strong enough to carry both of them without needing to be announced again. The days that followed did not announce themselves as turning points, and Thomas took that as a good sign, because real change rarely asked for attention. Mary moved a little farther each morning, leaning less on the splint and more on her own balance, and Thomas watched the progress without comment, understanding that recovery went better when it wasn't measured aloud. The ranch adjusted in quiet ways, an extra plate set out, water drawn twice, work divided without discussion, and the land accepted the rhythm as if it had always been there, which mattered more than any approval from people. Word traveled anyway, as it always did, but it arrived thinned and harmless, neighbors asking after Thomas's stock or the weather rather than the woman in his house. And he recognized the shape of a story losing its edges once it could no longer be sharpened into accusation. Mary spoke more freely now, not of the day she'd been left, but of what she could do when strength returned, the skills she carried that had never been considered worth keeping. and Thomas listened because futures grew best when spoken plainly. Once, a rider slowed at the fence line and lifted a hand in greeting. Nothing more, and Thomas returned it, the exchange settling something unspoken between the road and the ranch. That night, as the wind moved easy through the grass, Mary told him she had expected anger or pity, and found neither. And Thomas answered that land did not care where you came from, only whether you stayed and worked. And the truth of it eased something in her that pain had not touched. As the week turned, Thomas realized the promise had stopped being tested because it had stopped being questioned, and that was the real measure of its strength. The ranch was no longer a place she was hiding in, but a place she was becoming part of. And the land, having watched long enough to be convinced, began to accept her not as a burden or a cause, but as another life that had chosen not to walk away. By the time Mary could walk the length of the yard without the splint, the land had already decided what people took longer to accept, and Thomas understood that resolution rarely arrived as a moment, but as a quiet absence of resistance. The prairie held steady around them, fences straight, cattle calm, the house unchanged except for the way it now contained another life without strain, and Thomas felt the promise settle fully into the shape of ordinary days. Mary rose early and worked carefully at first, then with growing confidence, and no one questioned her presence because effort answered faster than explanation ever could. When a neighbor finally asked, not accusing and not curious, only practical, Thomas said she was staying. And the matter ended there, not because it had been argued away, but because it had been stated plainly and left to stand. Mary did not speak of her family again, not because the memory had faded, but because it no longer defined her direction. And Thomas respected the silence, knowing some endings were meant to close without ceremony. As summer edged closer, the ranch took on the easy rhythm of two people who understood boundaries and trust, sharing space without keeping score. And Thomas realized the promise he had made in the draw had not been about rescue or defiance, but about refusing to let abandonment be the final word. One evening, as the sun lowered and the land glowed the way it did only when nothing was being decided anymore, Mary thanked him once, simply, and Thomas nodded, because gratitude that arrived at the end did not ask to be repaid. The road stayed quiet, the past remained where it belonged, and the ranch continued as it always had, except fuller in a way that required no explanation. When Thomas closed the gate that night, the sound was familiar and complete, and he knew the promise no one had expected had been kept not through confrontation or sacrifice, but by choosing every day not to walk away again. If this story mattered to you, like it, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for stories of love, redemption, and survival.